Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So back to normal now after the ongo, right? Back to normal. So a couple of weeks ago, I gave the precepts to 5 people in this room. And before we take up this week's gate statement, 107, I want to say a couple things about that. So when I was in grad school, I encountered a book called Bowling Alone. And maybe you've heard of this book or you're familiar with it. It's about 25 years old now, so not a new book. I see some nodding. Written by a guy named Robert Putnam, who's a social scientist somewhere in that milieu. This book is an investigation into the breakdown of community in the 20th century. And we've, according to him, we've gone from being a nation of joiners to a nation of loners. So this was a useful book to me. This research was useful to me when I was in grad school because I was trying at the time to understand Sangha as a community in North America. So, you can study Sangha, but you have to study it in context. What is a community in North America? What does that mean? So this work that he was doing was useful to me. So the main finding of his years of research is that American sense of community forms this kind of inverted horseshoe. So it's kind of at a low point at about 1900 in the Gilded Age, because we have the robber barons and we have the people in the factories and the striking and all the inequity, right? There's political polarization, there's economic inequality, there's not much of a sense of interconnectedness or like we're all in this together, right? It's, everything for me, every person for himself. So things in this inverted horseshoe improve over the next 60 years. People become more trusting. More people are getting married, more people are joining clubs or groups or something. There's less social isolation. And Putnam says it's no coincidence that at the top of this horseshoe, civil rights movement sort of comes into its own in the 60s. And then it all slides back downhill until we reach today, which he's calling a second Gilded Age. So, and again, we have little feeling that we ought to be looking out for each other, that there's some sense of responsibility for other beings, other human beings, or that there's any kind of benefit to getting to know people who may be a little bit different from ourselves in some way. Now, why am I talking about that? Putnam went looking for causality. He's looking at this horseshoe, and he starts looking for causality. Well, causality is something we know about as Zen practitioners, right? Cause and effect is huge for us. It's really a fundamental part of our practice. So things don't arise from nothing, right? Cause has to be there. There has to be a seed. Conditions have to be right for something to arise. So what are the underlying causes and conditions for this inverted horseshoe? This is his question, because this is complicated, right? There is no one thing that says this is why it looks like this. Many, many, many factors are playing into this. So he's saying, what is the underlying cause? What's the causality for this inverted horseshoe? What's at the root of this complicated sort of rise and fall of community? And his conclusion is morality. A sense that we have some responsibility toward other people, that we're connected to each other in some way. We're not going to start dealing with polarization and inequality until we understand that we have some obligation to look out for each other, to take care of each other. So for us as practitioners, our teachings about ethics and morality are like right there, right in the Eightfold Path. Right livelihood, right speech, right action. We hear about ethics here all the time. Morality here all the time. So one important way that we practice with that, of course, is by taking precepts. So we vow not to kill people and take their stuff and misuse our relationships and about 13 other things. So we might not think that makes much of a difference in the midst of this world on fire. We're about to do a world peace ceremony, and someone said to me the other day, and boy, do we need it. And I think every month when we do the world peace ceremony, someone's thinking, and boy, do we need it. So we might not think simply, taking precepts and deciding to live in Buddha's way is going to make much of a difference in this world on fire. So 5 people deciding to pay attention to what they're doing with body, speech, and mind, we might go, well, that's nice. What does it mean in a nation with the highest level of political violence in the industrialized world? But as we discussed during the precepts retreat, the 4 kaite, and I can't remember if Myogen was there, One of the things the Bodhisattva gives as a result of taking vows is fearlessness. And we encounter that, and that can be surprising. One of the things we give as a result of our vows is fearlessness. So when I behave ethically, I stop being a threat to your life and property. And when that happens, then we start to develop some sense of trust, right? Because we become trustworthy. We are worthy of somebody's trust if we're vowing to live in that way and to carry out those precepts. So Putnam notes, joining anything, a running club, a sewing circle, a neighborhood cleanup day, whatever you like to join. How about a sangha? Begins to form the bridges and the connections with others that we need in order to investigate trustworthiness. What is trustworthiness about? When we start to have those connections with other people, we get to really investigate that in a very direct way. That individual activity then is the basis of creating national systems that are trustworthy, and pick whatever system you like. Government, industry, education, doesn't matter. So yes, that's indirect. Someone takes precepts, or someone makes a connection with a neighbor, or little by little. Yes, that's indirect, but you're not going to turn things around by just deciding you're going to revamp the government from the top down or revamp society from the top down. It's not possible to start that way, right? It has to be based on individuals living in such a way that what they're doing with body, speech, and mind is skillful and wise and compassionate and thoughtful. So 5 people just made that commitment here a couple of weeks ago. Some of us have done that sort of thing publicly in previous years. We've taken precepts either as lay people or as ordained sangha. Some of us more than once. Some of us have done it privately. We've made a personal, individual commitment to live in Buddha's way. Maybe we don't need to stand up in front of the sangha and declare that, but somewhere in here, we know that's our path. We know that's our life. So when I read about Putnam's latest work, at just about the same time that we were doing all of these precept ceremonies, lay people and ordained sangha, I saw how really important Sanshin is as a container for holding space, holding stability, making those things available to people in a world on fire. So how important is our practice then, right, in the midst of this world? There aren't a lot of places these days where you can go and do some really deep discernment with people about ethics, about morality, about interconnection, and the responsibilities we may have to each other. There just aren't a lot of places where you can go and really immerse yourself in that, and that there's some expectation that, yes, we have some responsibilities for other beings. So Sanshin's mission, of course, in fact, is to enable the investigation of interconnectedness as it manifests in community. This is what we're all about. Now, we do that in a specific way. We do that by doing the 6 Soto Zen practices that we list on the website. We engage in those 6 points. By simply following precepts, by simply doing our practice, we're actually doing something concrete to release ourselves and other beings from suffering. It might feel individual and like, oh, that's just about me. I would suggest it's bigger than that. We're learning how to live, how to give fearlessness. We're learning how to become trustworthy. So those can be the building blocks of some larger peaceful systems. It's got to start here with us. So there's a psychologist named John Bowlby, who says that all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. And I just think as a practitioner, that makes so much sense to me, right? Life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. Of course, that's what children do as they develop, right? Parents are home as a secure base, and then they become more and more able to explore. So this is a larger human pattern. This is what taking refuge is about to me, right? Where's the secure base? So when we take precepts, we take refuge in the 3 treasures. That becomes home. That's the base. We aspire to see the way Buddha sees and to understand emptiness and the way the universe actually functions in this moment of reality. And we know, yes, the historical 3 treasures are not here anymore, but maintaining 3 treasures, absolute 3 treasures, are still available to us. They are still a secure base for us. We can take these things as reliable guideposts for our practice and for our lives, and we can keep returning to them. We can keep coming back to them over and over and over and over and over. As we go out and daringly explore, we come back to that. as the secure base. So from there, we go out and lead our lives as karmic individuals, right? Each one of us is different. We have different circumstances and likes and dislikes and experiences and things we're good at, and right? All that stuff. We take our unique circumstances, our karmic circumstances, and we go out and do that exploration. And we can do that daring exploration without being a threat to anybody else. So sometimes daring exploration is thrilling because of danger and the unknown and all of those things. We can do that. We can do that without hurting people. We can do that and still be trustworthy. Because we can feel confident that we are supported by all beings, that this small self is not all there is. It's not disconnected from everything else. We can see the commonalities with other people. We can deal with them wisely and compassionately and following the precepts, even if they are not exactly like us. They own other things, they believe other things, they look different from us, whatever that is. So we need to live with a balance of secure base and daring exploration, rather than being a lot of no, 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 don't. Precepts are describing the life of the bodhisattva. So the point of those precepts is not to cut off the daring exploration, right? It's not to impose a lot of restrictions and make everybody the same, marching along, right? That would be boring. That would not be interesting. That would not be fun. So the precepts are not there to quash our creativity or our innovation or our independent individual thinking. That's not what any of that's about. We're allowed to explore. We're allowed to be as daring as we want to be, because we can do that in a safe way, a trustworthy way. Without precepts, though, of course, we run the risk of the community becoming unwholesome and chaotic and sort of individually focused in a way which is not healthy. Because in our individual exploration, we can forget that we have some responsibility toward others. If I'm all about my own path, if I'm all about my own exploration, I can forget, oh, wait a minute, there's others around that are affected by what I'm doing. We have some responsibility to be trustworthy. So precepts remind us that we have a community in the first place, I think, and that we're not isolated, we're not disconnected, even if sometimes we feel that way. So we can decide to take precepts as a support for our own individual practice, but we very quickly see it is not about us as individuals. Bodhisattvas can't maintain this sort of fabrication that they're cut off from others, or that they're cut off from the broadest possible view of this reality. Because if they're only looking at part of the picture, and they're only getting partial information, which is what that is, right? They can't do their jobs as bodhisattvas. Their job is to create the bridges. Their job is to recognize the interconnectedness and to function in that reality. So yes, they can enjoy, bonding with others like themselves that share some, interests. You can bond with people who enjoy basketball like you do, or like the same books, or whatever your interests are. Backgrounds, experiences, there's nothing wrong with that. But bodhisattvas can't stop there, right? They have to reach out to everybody if they're going to keep their vows and if they're going to keep the precepts. They can't exclude anybody. They can't cut anybody out. So, morality and isolation can't coexist. As soon as you take precepts, your life is all about the connections, right? You can't take precepts and then decide you're going to practice by going into a cave by yourself forever. It doesn't work like that. You can go into a cave for a year and do your silent retreat, but you got to come out again, right? You got to return to the marketplace. If you look at those precepts, every one of them is about how we enact relationships with others. Those precepts are not about I'm going to do some individual something which is only about me. Every one of those precepts is about how we interact with other people, what our relationships are like, how can we be trustworthy. So we can see that taking the precepts is really a vitally important act of peacemaking, although we would not necessarily consider it that way. We need to help and encourage each other in that practice, which is one of the reasons that Sangha is so important and one of the reasons that this place is so important in a world on fire. Sanchin is an oasis, right? World needs all the help it can get. Okay, let's turn to our gate statement for today. So it's been a while now since we've talked about the gate statements, so quick review. The 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination are part of the 12 fascicle version of Dogen's Shobogenzo. It's mostly it's a quote from another long text called the Sutra of the Collected Past Deeds of the Buddha. So this is not a list that Dogen wrote. He included it, and he wrote a final paragraph recommending that we all investigate these gates thoroughly. So if it's important to him, it seems important for us to consider all these gates. So out of 108, and I have to give you a bit of a spoiler, there are actually 109. There are 109 gates on the list of 108 gates. We are at 107. I've been talking about this text since 2016. We're down to the end finally. So, gate statement 107. The state beyond regressing and straying is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it is replete with the Dharma of past Buddhas. So in order to understand this week's gate statement, we need to understand the path of the Bodhisattva as it was described in the earliest teachings. And in general, there are said to be several stages that the Bodhisattva passes through on the way to becoming a Buddha. So this is a linear path in the early teachings. So stages are something like this: arousing bodhicitta, right? Arousing the aspiration to practice, experience awakening. Practicing sincerely, practicing wholeheartedly. Sometimes that means practicing the 6 paramitas. Sometimes that means gaining an understanding of suchness or emptiness, right? Depends on the teaching that you're looking at. In any event, actively engaging with the Dharma in some way. Next stage is usually non-regression, which means you're really, really close to Buddhahood. There's no going back. It's too late for you. The Dharma's got you, right? You're that close to Buddhahood. And finally, then you live your final lifetime in samsara, in some kind of karmic form, before you become a Buddha, right? So the third stage here is what the gate statement is talking about when it says the state beyond regressing and straying, right? So in Sanskrit, avaivartika. You can look that one up. So in the early text, these folks were described as exemplary monks, cognitive powers that were equal to arhats. They practice these deep, deep states of meditation. They have perfect wisdom. They teach the precepts to other beings. Their sitting practice is the samadhi that doesn't grasp anything at all, right? So these folks are not stuck anywhere, not hindered in any way. So the last time, gate 106, the last time I was in this seat, we talked about gate 106. We talked about receiving a prediction of Buddhahood, right? Somebody predicts you're going to be a Buddha. So if you do good things, you practice sincerely, you attain something called the samadhi of heroic progression. Here's another progression, the samadhi of heroic progression. You will receive a prediction or an assurance from the Buddha that you also will become a Buddha. So these predictions are directly associated with this non-regression, right? You get to a certain point, there's no more backsliding, you will become a Buddha. Somebody says, you're going to make it. You're almost there. You're going to make it, right? You progress in your practice. A Buddha, you get to that point and a Buddha says, you will also become a Buddha. So those 4 stages in the path of the Bodhisattva that I mentioned a minute ago, sometimes they get expanded into 10 bhumis, or 10 stages of attainment. Each one of those stages lays the groundwork for the next one. And so with each one, you gain some greater power, some greater wisdom, right? So the 8th of those stages is called immovable, because that's where your realization is irreversible. That's the point at which there's no going back. 8th out of 10. So you won't regress even after rebirth. Even if you keep being reborn and reborn, you will not regress. So there's no chance you're going to get wobbly on the path. There's no chance you're going to start backsliding somehow, having doubts, getting lazy. Gee, I don't feel like going to Zazen this morning at 5 a.m. or 6 a.m. or 4 a.m. Right? There's no chance you're going to be trying to get something out of this for yourself. I'm going to practice so that I become something or that I feel better or whatever, right? So you're not trying to reach nirvana purely for your own sake at this point. You've given that up as a delusion. You understand what a delusion that is. So at that point, all the kleshas, all the mental afflictions are exhausted. You're no longer stuck in samsara. You're moving around in samsara, but you're not stuck in samsara, right? You're completely absorbed in the Dharma. You see everything clearly. You practice all the paramitas. You make all the various vows that bodhisattvas make for the benefit of others. Those vows themselves start generating virtue. So there's a cycle happening, right? You can see why you can't go back. You've got something going in motion. So even though you're working for all beings, still you deeply understand no self and you don't make mistakes about the nature of the 5 skandhas. So what does that mean? Because that's an interesting point about this, right? Well, you're going along practicing the paramitas, mainly generosity, Because generosity, of course, is the basis for the other ones. We've talked a lot here about generosity, like the Wednesday book group. We spent how long on the Shishobo, right? And we really learned generosity is what underlies all the other things, up through wisdom. So you're practicing all the paramitas, but particularly generosity. That by itself is not enough to get you to non-regression. Those things are great. They're not enough. Non-regression only happens when you arouse great compassion for all beings. And that's not just, oh, I feel sorry for them, right? There's something which is not personal about that. Great compassion for all beings. But then when you do that, the minute you do that, something really interesting happens. Because of wisdom, you know all dharmas are empty. There really are no beings. There is nobody for you to save. There's nobody for you to feel compassionate toward, because there are no beings in the largest possible view, right? So at that moment, then your compassion starts to weaken. Well, there's nobody I need to save, right? There's nobody for whom I need to have compassion. There aren't any beings to feel compassionate toward. So compassion starts to drop off. At the same moment, though, you're aware of, because of wisdom, you're aware of the suffering and the misery and the delusion of beings in the world that need your help. And your wise sort of vision of emptiness, in turn, starts to weaken because compassion is rising up again. So we have to hold both of these things, right? We have to have the wisdom to see everything's empty. Five skandhas are empty. That's the wisdom piece. But we have to have the compassion to see, and yet there are beings and beings are suffering. So now, you're at non-regression because you have these two things in balance. You have wisdom and compassion in balance. They're always going around and around and balancing each other, because it would be easy to fall into one or the other. So the bodhisattva at this point is strong enough, he or she or they carry both of these things equally, right? Compassion doesn't hinder you from seeing emptiness in a really deep way. Your wisdom doesn't keep you from recognizing suffering and trying to liberate beings. So out of this intersection comes skillful action. Now the bodhisattva at this level completely understands emptiness in a way that lets him see reality in a kind of a new way, or a different way, right? They are compared to people who've like woken up from a dream. So this is a metaphor we hear in this practice, right? It's like this is the dream world and we kind of wake up from the dream. So these are the bodhisattvas who've awakened from this dream, right? They're not confused about causes and conditions. They're not confused about dependent arising. They know where suffering comes from. They know how things come to be. They don't even have to think about what skillful action is. They just automatically do the right thing because they have the wisdom and the compassion and balance. It's not an intellectual process. They don't look at something and say, now what should I do? They just do. And they do the right thing. And somehow they know what that is. So it sounds pretty great, right? When we reach this rung of the ladder, there are only a couple of more levels until we reach Buddhahood. This is a great place to be. Unless you happen to be a follower of Dogen, or other teachers who say, well, practice and awakening, not actually separate. This is not actually a linear path. You can't progress toward Buddha or awakening because Buddha or awakening is already here, so there's nowhere to go. Wouldn't you know? Couldn't be that easy. So, in Keisei Sanshoku, or the sound of the streams, the shape of the mountains, Dogen tells a story about Lingyun Zhichin, or Chinese, that's the Chinese, and Japanese Reun Shigon. This guy's been practicing for 30 years, so he's not a beginner. He's traveling in the mountains, and he sees off in a distant village peach blossoms are blooming. And suddenly he has an awakening experience. And he writes a poem. For 30 years I sought a swordsman. How many times leaves fell and new ones sprouted. Once seeing the peach blossoms, nothing more to doubt. This is his poem. So even though he's been practicing for 3 decades, he's been chasing after awakening, we assume, because that's what humans do. So every fall he sees the leaves turn color, fall to the ground. Every spring he sees new leaves coming up on the branches, and still somehow he isn't there yet. Now he's seen these peach blossoms over here. Somehow he gets it. In that moment he gets it, right? The causes and conditions were both there in that moment for awakening to happen. Somehow the seed had been planted. He's carrying the seed around. Somehow those peach blossoms, that was it. Causes and conditions came together. He has an awakening experience. So he writes this poem and he shows it to his teacher. And his teacher says, well, those who enter through conditions and circumstances never regress. So in other words, teacher acknowledges the student has experienced awakening through this tangible bit of nature, this thing that he could see and touch, right? These peach blossoms, the blooming of these flowers. So he says, yes, this was your gateway. And he has, entered through conditions. But Dogen says, does anyone enter except through conditions? Does anyone ever regress? In other words, there is no experience or manifestation of awakening except in this tangible world. Where else was he going to have this experience, right? How else was this going to happen? Awakening is not something out there, it's about concrete practice with this body in this world. So the things we encounter are not other than Buddha, are not other than awakening, are not other than emptiness. So does anyone enter except through conditions? Like what other way is there, right? So practice and awakening, not two things. But then he asks, does anyone ever regress? Is there really progression and regression? How can there be if in this moment, which is all there is, practice and awakening are arising together? How can there be progression and regression? So there's nowhere to get to, and there's nowhere to fall away from. You can't backslide if everything is here. Where can you go? So Sawaki Roshi also said, progress, regression, who knows what goes on in the right or wrong direction? What's good and what's bad? A cure can be a poison, and a poison can be a cure. So suffering is uncomfortable, right? And yet suffering lets us know we're being caught up in delusion. Uh-oh, we've gone off the rails somewhere. Something doesn't feel okay. Time to practice, right? Strengthens our aspiration, perhaps, to see clearly and to liberate ourselves and other beings from suffering. Being devoted to Buddha's teachings is great until we cling to one teaching or another in some kind of rigid, unflexible way. Doesn't account for impermanence, right? But Buddha said, well, okay, but, right? And we all know, look around the canon. He says this over here, he says something else over there, right? So, becoming mature enough in the practice to take precepts. Fantastic. We've just said that's an active peacemaking, activity. Wonderful thing. Until we use those precepts as a yardstick for measuring the behavior of other people, right? Todo-san tells us repeatedly, we can't use those precepts as a yardstick in that way. We can't cling to them as a measure in that way, right? So all of these things are wonderful. Dharma, precepts, Buddha's teaching, all that's great until, right? Cure can become a poison and poison can become a cure. So our teachers are reminding us that none of this stuff is really linear, even when it might look like that. In this human form, things look linear. We do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. But our teachers are, I think, just taking that nice, convenient step-by-step plan away from us. They've just pulled that out from under us and said, no, you don't. We have to be really careful, though, that we understand what they're saying about this without making a mistake. It would be really easy to read this as saying, oh, well, awakening is already here. We don't need to practice because there is no progression and no regression. So what's the point of, getting on the cushion or coming to the Zendo or reading and studying and all those things? Anything we want to do is okay because Buddha's already here, right? This is a pretty common pitfall, which of course would be a big misunderstanding, right? This is the same question Dogen was working with in his early years. If awakening is already here, why do we need to practice, right? This was his great doubt. This is what he's talking about in the beginning of the Kanza Zengi. If everything is already okay, why are we making all this effort to practice? But again, Dogen says, does anyone enter except through conditions? So how can awakening be realized except through the practice of this body and mind? So Sawaki Roshi ran into this misunderstanding, even in his day, even in his fellow clergy, right? He went to give a talk once, and then he later told this story about giving the talk. So he says, when I went to give a talk in a country temple, a young priest asked if he could give an introductory talk before me. Go ahead, I said, and listen to his talk. So this is the young priest talking now. The principle of Mahayana Buddhism is, this body as it is Buddha. Since this body as it is Buddha, there is no need for religious practice, and no need to worry about regressing. Whatever you do is okay. And Sawaki Roshi says, I thought he was making a serious mistake. After that, I gave my talk. We are all hopelessly deluded, so we have to do something if we want to be Buddhas. We can't be Buddhas by doing nothing. So there is no meaning in saying this body is Buddha. When I said this, contradicting the young priest, he was visibly disturbed. So, ouch, right? I mean, imagine being shown up in your own temple in front of your own congregation by Sawaki Roshi. That could not have been a comfortable experience. So I've always wondered why the younger clergy said what he said. You know, like, why was he telling his congregation, whatever you want to do, it's okay. You don't need religious practice. I mean, imagine somebody wearing this and telling, religious practice, right? I mean, I've always kind of like wondered what was going on there, right? Like, was he trying not to scare the congregation because he might be worried about what Sawaki Roshi was going to say? Because, like, maybe he had this reputation, right? Like, he was a Zazen guy. He was a tough Zazen guy. He sat for hours and hours and hours, like for years by himself. And so I can imagine this young priest thinking, what's he going to say to my congregation? Right? No, whatever you want to do is okay. Because you think about, like, why did he want to go first? We'll never know. By the way, Sawaki Roshi was there to talk about the Fukan Zengi. So everybody had to know he was going to be, like, advocating Zazen. So you just wonder, was this young guy worried about the reaction in his congregation? So, here's the famous Sawaki Roshi to talk about Zazen, but don't worry, Well, you don't actually have to do it. Just listen to his talk. Like, you just got to wonder. Anyway, the young guy wasn't wrong. This body is Buddha, right? I mean, we hear this all the time. There is nothing that is separate from Buddha. He's not wrong, but you only realize awakening with it when you sincerely practice. So just reading books or listening to a lecture by Sawaki Roshi or anybody is not enough. You got to actually do something. So I love when he says something about if you want to be a Buddha, we have to do something if we want to be Buddhas. We can't be Buddhas by doing nothing. So again, our gate statement says, the state beyond regressing and straying is a gate of Dharma illumination, for it is replete with the Dharma of past Buddhas. So to be replete, to be complete and not lacking anything. So to be beyond regressing and straying is to carry the same Dharma as our ancestors. In other words, to fulfill this prediction of Buddhahood, which is really closely tied to this whole non-regression thing. So depending on your branch of Buddhism, going beyond regression is either because you've developed this powerful practice, you've developed some deep wisdom, or because it's not possible to regress because practice and awakening, not to, both here in this moment. So in any event, we've put ourselves into the same space with our ancestors or with past Buddhas. We're doing the same Zazen. We're carrying and experiencing the same Dharma. Buddhist practice is still going on because we are here doing it. We are in the same space, right? You will often hear me and others say the person who's just learned to sit Zazen 5 minutes ago is doing the same Zazen as the person who's been sitting for 30 years. We're entering into that same space. It's the same Zazen, right? So when I'm practicing in Japan, I like to imagine all the people who have been practicing in this temple wherever I am for the last 600 or 800 years or whatever. Imagine the number of people. I used to have that same experience in Minnesota, and at the time that place was only 30 years old. And I used to think, wow, how many people have sat in the Zendo for 30 years? So in those temples, some of the relics are still there, some of the things people were using, still there to be seen. We're still wearing the same stuff. We're still doing the same practice. Time sort of collapses in those really old temples. It could be 600 or 800 years ago. You're looking at the same stuff, and you're wearing the same things, and you're doing the same activity. And you really get this sense of this moment contains everything. So Sanshin's only been here for 20 years, but still, think of all the people who've sat on your cushion, sat in your place, been in this Zendo, right? Been in this temple, in this same space where we are now. And of course, that's in the same Zazen space as well as in this physical space. So when we say that the absolute Sangha is, all beings across time and space, it includes all the beings that there are, we're recognizing our sincere aspiration to practice in a connected way, to practice that connection. And this is, I think, what helps to make us sort of replete with this Dharma of past Buddhas. So what would you like to say today or ask about any of the precepts-related morality things that I talked about first, or this whole non-regression gate that I talked about second? Let's start with people here because I can see you, and then I'll ask Doju to facilitate online comments or questions. Anything in the room anybody would like to say? Doju, anybody out at home who'd like to say something today?
Hey Doju, can you hear me?
Give us a minute to move our cameras around.
Yes, I hear you. Go ahead.
All right, yeah, I mean, Hoko, I think this is a perfect timing for this talk, I think, related to, all the things that we're, mitigating and managing in the world. But for me, one of the things that keeps coming up is wanting to, even with the Bodhisattva principles and the discerning nature is wanting to get caught up in, it's all of us. It's not just the people that we choose, right? That it's all beings, right? So that's something that I keep working with, in the midst of all of what we're working with. That's something that's kind of tangible for me. So, and also that you said being open to not just people of similar thinkings and views, and how sometimes I am resistant to even having a conversation sometimes when those things come up. So just any thoughts on that?
Well, it's hard, isn't it? Right? Because if we're going to have a conversation with somebody with views that differ from ours, we don't know how we're going to be received or how that's going to go. It can be very uncomfortable, right? So naturally defensiveness arises because these 5 skandhas, we need to protect these 5 skandhas. So can we remember these 5 skandhas are impermanent, and sort of remove the hindrances that keep us from listening clearly, from looking someone in the eye, from really being present with that conversation. So, you've heard me say many times here, compassion is not condoning, acceptance is not approval. We don't have to approve of toxic behavior. We don't have to approve of things that are harmful that others may be doing, but that doesn't mean we cut off connection. Because actually we can't, right? I mean, interconnectedness is here. There's this network of interconnection which we can't deny, although we would like to. So making that separation is a fabrication, it's a hindrance. That doesn't mean we have to put ourselves in harm's way. That doesn't mean we have to go along with things that we think are unwholesome. Simply to be open to the bridging is step number 1. So, in a world today where there's a lot of division, this is, in one way, it's a really hard practice to do, and in another way, boy, do we have opportunities. Like, we can't turn around without seeing an opportunity to sort of consider, what is my responsibility to other beings in this moment? So when I was, thinking about, reading again about Putnam's work and thinking about that, and he says, the causality here is morality, I actually had to stop and think, like, what does that mean? When we think about morality, we think about a lot of right and wrong, and I'm better than you, and I'm righteous, and you're, and I had to stop and think, like, what is morality about? And when you look into what it's about, it's, do we feel some responsibility for other beings in this world? Do we understand that interconnectedness is already here? So that's very much not about holding up a yardstick and being judgy and preachy, and right? Because that would just, nobody wants to hear that. You're going to cut off connection just because nobody wants to hear you be, preachy and holier than thou. That's not what morality is about. Morality is about, do I understand that we're all in this thing together? And it would be really easy some days to say, but I don't want you in my boat. Like, I'm sailing along just fine, but like you, I don't want you in my boat. So our challenge as bodhisattvas is to look at that resistance. Like, what's going on there? There's something about the 5 skandhas clinging to 5 skandhas, right? There's something that we feel like we need to shore up. So what is it we're clinging to? Are we really about to be annihilated? Or are we just about to be uncomfortable? And then what is that about, right? So there's no easy answer to that. I mean, Putnam himself says, I don't know how we're going to fix this. And he's tried like a bunch of projects over 25 years. He's gotten think tanks together, and he's had seminars, and he's tried to think about how do we, and he says every one of those things has failed. And you just think on the one hand, well, that's discouraging. And on the other hand, I think, well, good for him that he says, I tried stuff. It didn't work, but I tried stuff. And I think as bodhisattvas, that's what we do, right? We make the best move we can make in that moment with the information and the skills and the ability that we have, and then we have to let go of the outcome, because we can't then say, isn't this great, I fixed it, or, oh, I'm a terrible person, it failed. It's like, you got to do what you can do, let go of the results, and the next moment you do the next thing you can do. So why is it important for us to develop wisdom and compassion? So we know what skillful action is. Because it's so easy to be unskillful, right? Fusatsu, that's more than you wanted, I'm sure. Do you have anything else you want to add there?
I mean, I know, and I think this is a prime opportunity for practice, because as I feel it in my body when I'm tensing up to even think about having that conversation, but it is yet and something else to yet work with in bodhisattva practice. So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah. Can we get information? Can we get the broadest possible view we can get? Because that in itself is not easy. Other things folks would like to say? Hoshin's in the room, and while Doju's looking at folks at home, let's hear from Hoshin.
You said something early on at the beginning when you were talking about the precepts, giving the precepts, about giving
Fearlessness.
fearlessness.
Isn't that interesting?
I really like it. It feels like it is advanced bodhisattva practice.
And yet, right?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to cut you off.
That's all right. I just kind of wanted you to expand on that a little bit more, if you could.
Yeah. So isn't that interesting that, we think about, well, what are the things we give? Well, we give material support. Somebody needs a sandwich, someone needs a home. We think about, well, we teach the Dharma. People want to know what Buddha said. We give fearlessness. Because if I'm practicing sincerely, I'm not a threat to you. And somehow you can see that I'm not a threat to you, right? I mean, what an interesting way to turn that around. So it's like, I'm not here to protect you from all that. I'm here to protect you from me. Because every one of us can slip. Every one of us can make a mistake and be unskillful, right? So I'm sure some place in our lives, we've encountered somebody and we just, in that person's presence, we have felt safe, we have felt relaxed, we have felt authentic. This person is not a threat to me. So maybe it's grandma, and maybe it was a teacher or a neighbor or a friend or something. Someplace probably in our lives we encountered it. We didn't know why that person felt like that for us. Right? I don't have to worry when I'm here with that person. And it's not necessarily that person's going to protect me from the world. It's just like, I don't have to be somebody else. I can be the authentic me with that person, right? So how would it be if we went through the world, moved through the world, giving fearlessness, right? I get a kick out, some of you know I ride a Vespa. Tree fell on my car, so now I'm really riding the Vespa. And when I'm riding the Vespa, I wear a sequin denim jacket. And I got it at the Goodwill, so I got it cheap. And at the time, I think I got the jacket before I got the Vespa. But it makes a lot of sense to me because it's high visibility on this Vespa with all my sequins going. And it's a little, if I came off that bike, I'd be injured, but, it's a little bit of protection. So I can't tell you how many comments I get on this sparkly jacket, riding the Vespa with my helmet on, People will stop at stoplights, I love your jacket. And I think it makes people smile. They're not afraid of me because you could see someone on a Vespa and go, oh, that's a hotshot. I'm gonna stereotype now, I'm sorry. That's a hotshot kid who's gonna, drive unsafe. Well, what they don't know is inside all of this is a 62-year-old bald woman. What they don't know is there's a Buddhist nun on the Vespa, right? But I can't tell you how that breaks barriers for people. I go stop and get a sandwich, and the first thing the counter person will say, oh, I love your jacket, right? I just feel like that's the kind of feeling, because I could show up like this and people would be worried. What's this, big bald woman doing? What's that about? But I've got this funny jacket on, it makes people smile. So I just feel like that's the feeling. We go through the world saying, you don't have to be afraid of me. Wouldn't it be nice if we met people and our first thought was not, do I need to be afraid of that person or worried about that person, or are they going to be a threat to my life and property, right? So if we could go through the world giving fearlessness, wouldn't that be great? I just think it's a really interesting aspect of Bodhisattva vow. Yeah? Anything else you want to say about that?
Well, it just, I think it says a whole lot more than that, but thinking of someone practicing with fearlessness, it's just part of a mindset. Mm-hmm. It means that there's a kind of clarity about your practice, mm-hmm. and about your vows, and about everything we do in this practice, mm-hmm. as a bodhisattva.
Well, because it's interesting. We could so when I think about giving fearlessness, I'm thinking giving fearlessness to people who are not necessarily practicing. But if we turn that another way, we could say we are encouraging other people to practice without fear. Because when we start to really look deeply at these five skandhas, if we aren't careful, we can let go of self in a way that feels like annihilation, or feels like it can be really scary. Like, if I'm not me, who am I? What is going on here? And if we start to let go of self in that way, it can feel a little bit disorienting. I mean, I've seen that happen to people, like in Sesshin, right? It's got to be careful about that. So, can we also encourage our fellow Sangha members to practice without fear? And isn't that another sort of interesting take on that? So, we ourselves don't need to be fearful of our practice, and can we support others to not be fearful in their practice? Because this is new territory, right? If this was easy, we would have done it by ourselves a long time ago. And instead, we're getting on a cushion and looking at a wall and sort of taking ourselves apart in a certain kind of way. And that can be scary. Even the boredom can be scary. What pops up when I'm not distracting myself with other things that I'd much rather be thinking about? Oh my gosh, the demons start to show up, right? Okay, all thinking is fabrication, all thinking is fabrication, all thinking is fabrication.
Including that.
Pardon me?
Including that.
Including that. What would you or others like to say this morning? And Doju, have we got anybody at home?
Not.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Please.
All right. I got something.
Okay.
Well, at least I know what to get you for your birthday.
Uh-oh.
A nice leather jacket that says Buddha, Hell's Buddhas. It could have the night tomorrow with the wheel.
No, I love it.
One of the things that I've kept as a holdover from my Tibetan practice 20 years ago is that when we get done with zazen and we bow, I dedicate my merit to all sentient beings. Mm-hmm. And about a year ago, I realized those sentient beings are sitting with me. They're not separate. Mm-hmm. And so my dedication is to and with. And that is one of the things, I've always had a hard time with morality. Mostly from a philosophical standpoint. It's boring. But I find it interesting that when we do think about others, when we realize and we see that, when we see that connection, even though a minuscule connection, that is very, very powerful in what we do and how we act. Best example I can give you is I tell everybody I'm an angry driver. Well, now that I've been sitting to and with people, to and with all sentient beings, I'm an individual, but I'm also separate. I have my individual exercise to do in life. I think, well, would honking my horn at this slow person who's driving me crazy do any good? No, not really. It'd probably rankle them. They're probably having a bad day. So it's like, okay, I will just sit back and calm down. And it just goes fine. So I really, really do think that when you do talk about morality, Buddhist morality or whatnot, it is inherent, it is our practice. Mm-hmm. And it is one of the reasons why I took these vows. Mm-hmm. It's, not for me, it's for everybody. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And, one of the things we learn when we look at that Eightfold Path, prajna, shila, samadhi, so we have wisdom and ethics and sitting, and it becomes very clear that those three things are not actually separate. So sometimes when I'm talking about that, I'll say, for instance, if we were looking only at the wisdom side, we could get really, really, really good at killing people. Right? We can get really, really, really good at taking their stuff because we can be smart and apply all kinds of things to how are we going to do that. Without the morality piece, without the sitting piece, we become unskillful. So it's not enough to have one of those three. We need all of them. So somehow underlying all of that needs to be this understanding about interconnectedness. I think what you're talking about on the road is a prime example of giving fearlessness. Right? You're not about to cause an accident on the road because yes, you're one car on the road, but how many other cars are there on the road? You're not out there by yourself. It's a great metaphor, right? So if you're ricocheting from one car to the next, creating mayhem, that's a problem. So I think staying calm on the road is a prime example of giving fearlessness that maybe arises from the practice. I think Doju or others had something to say.
Yeah, when you sort of started talking about morality in sort of a somewhat political context, it reminded me of, the research that I did a few years back about Buddhism and politics.
Yeah, yeah.
And I forget the name of the author, but there was a book I read on the topic, and he sort of presented kind of two models of Buddhist political morality. One being sort of a kind of Amish-like model, where we create this sense of community and sort of bring the world that we want into practice within our own community. And in the author's opinion, that was probably more like what the historical Buddha had in mind, perhaps. And then, of course, there's the more modern kind of like social justice warrior Buddhist model. And so I'm curious to hear your kind of thoughts on those two models in the context of what you spoke to in the beginning.
Well, I mean, in a way, I don't need to have an opinion about that. Because skillful action in one context is not going to be skillful action in another context, so we can't say one of those is necessarily always going to be better or more skillful than the other. And I certainly raised this today in a bit of a political context, although I'm really looking at it more broadly than that. As you know, I'm looking at it more broadly than that. So I always want to be careful when I bring up anything that could be put into a political context, because I'm not here to make a statement like that. But I think what's interesting about what you're pointing out is there's more than one way to consider how does a healthy community take care of beings. Because I think you could look at both of those examples and say the people who are engaged in those practices very much are about taking care of beings. And there's more than one way to do that. And I think both of those models would say they're looking broadly and they're looking beyond individuals, and they're saying we want to create functioning, we want to create some dynamic functioning that is healthy and is not obstructed and is not toxic and whatever. So there are going to be occasions where we're going to see something going on in the world which we think is unwholesome, and we're going to feel the need to stand up and say something about it, maybe. And there are skillful ways to do that. And I mean, we certainly saw Buddha sitting under a dead tree to hold off the war. And there are things we can do about that, and that's good. But I guess what it makes me, as I'm just talking and thinking about that, I'm thinking it feels like, on the one hand, we're fixing the problems in a system, and in the other one, we're building a system which is more fearless, right? I mean, I think we need both of those things, because no system is going to be perfect. No community is ever going to be perfect. We still are going to need a way to say, something went off the rails here. What are we going to do about that, right? Because no community is ever going to be without that. Even Toto-san has said, no community is without conflict. There's going to be conflict. Our practice is in how do we skillfully take care of that conflict. Not how do we manage it, how do we quash it, how do we get rid of it. How do we recognize it and skillfully take care of it, because these are individual karmic beings. And we've all got different circumstances, and you're going to believe something, and I'm going to believe something, and someone else is going to have another idea, right? And that marketplace of ideas is going to be important. How do we do that skillfully, right? So I think it probably is that we need two ways of practice. One is, let's think about what Sangha, now I'm going to put this in a Sangha context, right? Let's think about what a Sangha is, and let's think about what a healthy Sangha is, and what our responsibilities are to each other in a Sangha, because this is sort of, if we can learn to do this in a Sangha, can we learn to do it in a larger context, right? So like, what are our responsibilities within a Sangha to each other? We've all got different roles here. We've all been practicing, in different ways, different times. No one's better than another. We're all sitting in the same zazen, but we've all got responsibilities for each other. Like, what does that look like? And in a healthy world, what does that look like? And then when something goes off the rails, somebody makes a mistake, or the community makes a mistake, what do we do about that, right? So I think it's really interesting now that I'm thinking about that, because I really think we need to act in both of those ways. I don't think we can do one to the exclusion of the other. I think we have to act in both of those ways. And I think we can and still be skillful. I want to think about that. Actually, you're raising an interesting thing that I want to go home and think about some more, so thank you for that. Because I'm really interested in org development as it relates to Sanghas, and now you're making me do some discernment about that. That's really interesting. I might come back to you for some, because you've done some research, I might come back to you. You'll be sorry. What would others like to say or ask today?
Build on that, I mean, that creates a complicated situation, right? Because
Yeah,
community requires certain standards in order to hold the space.
yeah, certain expectations or
So we
conventions.
have the idea of no separation
Mhm.
and leave no sentient being behind.
Mhm.
But we also have a space to hold, and that requires the enforcement of some amount of standards.
Mhm.
So I remember there was a situation in LA. It was a public event. We were doing Dharma combat.
Mhm.
The particular koan that we were working with was the kill the cat.
Uh-huh.
And there were a couple of people who seemed a little disruptive and maybe somewhat drunk, and they wandered in, walked in with shoes on their head.
Oh, yes.
So, I mean, you get the reference.
Yes.
And Nazumi threw him out.
Mhm.
Actually, he basically told Dido to go over there and tell those people to leave, right?
Mhm.
Because there was a perspective that was disruptive to
Yeah.
the function of what we were doing in that space at that time.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I remember Ram Dass saying something like, do whatever you have to do with another human being, just don't take them out of your heart, right?
Mhm.
So, how do you deal with a disruptive situation in which you might have to expel somebody from the immediate environment at that moment?
Well, sure, you need both wisdom and compassion. So the compassionate thing was remove those people. The wise and compassionate thing was remove those people so that the Hosenshiki could go on, right? And who knows, I'm sure they were not in a position to participate in some way which was meaningful for them, right? So that sounds to me, I mean, I wasn't there, sounds to me like that was the wise and compassionate thing to do. Sometimes you remove somebody from that situation. But as you say, you don't separate them from the Sangha, from compassion, from making sure they're okay, right? People will make mistakes, and then how do we help them in that moment, and then how do we help them afterward? So that doesn't seem inappropriate to me. Did it feel inappropriate to you?
No, it seemed perfectly reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, anytime I find myself in a situation like that,
Yeah.
you know, how do I correct for a problem of standards
Yeah.
in a way that doesn't create in my mind a separation?
Yeah.
Because sometimes you have to create a separation.
You do. You do. But what kind of separation is that? Are you cutting those people off by throwing them out of the song and say, you're terrible people? Or are you saying, in this moment, you and the conditions you're in need to be, somewhere else? So I don't think this is saying there can't be communal expectations. Esho's just joined a communal living situation, and I'm sure they have regulations and rules and guidelines about how they're going to live. Who's going to take out the trash this week, and who's going to balance the books, right? There have to be some kind of guidelines. I mean, that's, we can take precepts that way if we want to. I don't think that's cutting off anybody. That is a trellis, right, for healthy functioning. And people can make a choice about whether they want to be in that community or not. If those rules feel restrictive, if those things feel toxic, we're not requiring them to be there. So I think having some shared understanding about who we are as a community and what we're here to do is important. We have a mission statement here and a vision statement here so that everybody knows when you're walking in the door here, this is what we do. We also have, if you look on our website, a whole long ethical guidelines document that says, here's how we are together. Here's a description of our relationship. Here's how we are together. If mistakes get made, here's what's going to happen. Here's the way we can resolve those mistakes. We need that stuff, right? But I think we can do that without causing separation. It's based on wisdom and compassion. It's okay, right?
Well, as you said, there is no separation on the cosmological scale,
Yes.
but there is localized separation.
Well, there's also individual karmic beings at work here, right? We can't live only in the place of the absolute. We also have to say, who are these human beings in their karmic form that are in front of me right now, and what are they doing? What are they doing with body, speech, and mind? And do we need to put them somewhere else for a while, right? We can't ignore that, because if we do, we're not doing bodhisattva work. We've got a partial view. If I've got somebody having a breakdown in front of me, I need to deal with that. I can't just walk away, well, you're just a pile of five skandhas, you don't really exist. It doesn't work, right? It's not compassionate. So yes, we have to take care of people. If there's some shared understanding about what a Hosenshiki is, those folks, I hope, would not have shown up in the condition they were in. But who knows? I wasn't there. Other things from anybody today? Comments, questions, reflections? Or shall we move along to world peace?
Yes, let's
Yes? Let's create some world peace. All right, thank you, everybody. We'll do our closing chant.